So our team was part of a 2-team effort, and this is the first half, which is trying to monitor for disease outbreaks. So here's our project team, a nice mix from biology side and compute side. This was our project assignment, which was in the materials given to us. And so we tried to parse this down and create something useful, at least from a strategy. So the primary goal was one of these things: identify novel emerging pathogens, recognizing emerging outbreaks of known pathogens, or recognize emerging genomic variants of known pathogens. So we sort of struggled with which of these things was perhaps most important or vital. We also thought about the context in which we were assigned this, which is CDC funding is less than it was. Same could be said for many state public health resources. So where can we get good, reliable data, or at least usable data to inform some of what we want to answer? Also thinking about One Health, veterinary, and other resources that inform human health. The minimum kinds of things we want to be able to generate and share would be dates, location, case counts, disease types or symptom constellations, and some other things would be nice if we can get them. We brainstormed potential inputs. The requirements for those inputs would be early warning and knowing where the data was coming from. So we know we have things like MMWR, ProMed, Mail, Health Maps, things like this, but if those are already in those resources, then we should have already known that too. So the goal was to take something like that and work back in time to see if we could have predicted that ahead of time. So then we started to think about the inputs that could give us that early warning, including social feeds. Clinicians will use Dr. Google, so to speak. So if they ping up to date or something to say, what does measles rash look like again? We want to know about that if possible. Pharmacies have some cool data available, as well as diagnostic companies have cloud data on like what respiratory viruses are circulating. So some of these things we'd have to have partnerships to tie into. Knowing that not all the data that we'd like to have would be available, we also stepped back and said, why are we doing this? The answers are probably resource allocation, either put boots on the ground or activate other more sensitive and specific surveillance tools. Epidemiologists like to focus on recency, severity, things that are otherwise unrecognized and appear to be uncontrolled. So this was our model of how to approach it, find data that might give us some sensitive early warning, even if it's not true, and then have a way to specify that data and say, oh, that's not correct, that's probably not real, and potentially activate other resources like sending surveys to people who might have posted online and get some additional information from them, or pull from public health resources to look at that a little more closely and activate additional tools to interrogate the data further. So then we thought, well, how could we put this together in a meaningful way? We tried to search fever and rash for Google Trends to see people that might have searched these terms, knowing that we've had recent outbreaks of measles and monkeypox. So from the dates that those outbreaks were announced, could we go back in time 2 weeks or 4 weeks and see if there was an uptick of searching in those areas that was unexplainable by other things going on at the time? Turns out that Google didn't like us asking that many things so quickly. Pass it off to Alex.
Okay, so after we ran into a lot of roadblocks when we were acquiring the data and also scoping down the project, because at first we were not quite sure on which exact steps we wanted to do, but the 3 stages that we wanted to maybe break down to that were already mentioned were like detection with high sensitivity, validate with a higher specificity, and then determine next steps. And we thought maybe the most interesting for this hackathon would be the second step, where we validate for the higher specificity with all the data endpoints that we heard before. But we needed also to have some starting point from where we go. So after we narrowed down this project, we tried to parallelize our work a little bit. So different group members just wrote minors for different websites. So it was not as structured as we've just seen a presentation. It was more quick and dirty minors to just get some input data. But we set up a repository where we could just put all the data into. And we had an LLM agent add a catalog entry for every data entry that we have. And this was a short summary. So subsequent agents will be able to also find the data and maybe correlate stuff together. And after we now spent are they creating this data repository? We now also wanted to have some results of how such an agent could look like. So that's what we then also spent time on. So after we compiled this data repository, we implemented an outbreak flagger that was working through the catalog of data entries and tried to just flag with a high sensitivity as we started, just potential outbreaks. And it was instructed to include also the metrics that we heard before. And after the potential outbreaks file was actually then generated, we then started with the rest of the workflow. So we had another devil's advocate agent that tried to get these potential outbreaks, but also say, hey, is this really an outbreak? But we didn't want to code all this ourselves. So we tried to be very flexible and modular in this architecture. So it really just then created alternate hypotheses without hard-coded how should it check these. Because this then we gave to the next agent. So there was a data gatherer that knew about which data we already have, and then looked through the hypotheses and then set up a plan on which data we need and which data we need to check, which additional data we also need to maybe check these hypotheses and really validate whether these outbreaks are meaningful. And then we had a crawling agent that began the cycle. So we have like the cyclical architecture where crawling agent then went back to the web and tried to gather more data and put it back into the same repository. So we have a growing knowledge base over time. And after we gathered all this stuff, we still wanted to have some example of what conclusions we could draw from this. So the third step, what following steps, and what is now our assessment of the hypotheses that we proposed. So this is what these output files did look like in our test. So this was about, it found much data supporting a monkeypox outbreak in Central and Eastern Africa. It pulled together the data sources, and then it listed hypotheses. And then also listed alternate hypotheses and tried to gather data to validate or refute these hypotheses. So in this case, it's a confidence level medium, but with a high risk level. This is only now an example, like we hacked together on how these data repositories working with many data sources that are not of the best quality maybe or have different formats, how we could pull this together. And with LLMs, the good thing is that we can often have just free text data. So no matter how we actually crawl this, the output can be summarized and subsequent analyses can build on the data. Let's mention a little bit of the potential impact. So the modular nature of this framework makes it more robust. So that means we try to avoid it just hallucinating and going after the same hypothesis by putting guardrails in there, putting intermediate files, which are then checked by subsequent steps. And given that we had a hackathon and everyone wanted to start right away, we had this independent adding of data sources as a potential impact. And the good thing is that the output is then actually a documentation of the evidence chain. So it might actually have more useful results. Future directions, of course, that we wanted a multimodal architecture. This was a big discussion at the start. Do we add genomics or not? But then we thought, okay, if we now add the genomics also in this project idea that was already getting very large, this could have been a separate project and we did not include it right away. And also the social media Google Trends data that was mentioned before, we ran into a lot of trouble acquiring these reliably. So we actually did not include it in our project so far. What would be required is also to add more validation data refinement steps because this data repository grew over time and now it needs to be managed somehow so the LLM actually has some direction. We also don't do any real epi modeling, so it is also needs to be added, I guess. All right, then let's go to questions.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat which says, how would you like to integrate data like genomics that is not really text?
Some of you may remember the COVID-19 outbreak recently. So as additional mutations came to light that then went through the population again, there's always the question of, is it more severe or not? So as we learn what those genomic features may have implications, then we could use those to modulate the risk interpretation of the data that's being gleaned. So we might say, and we're seeing a lot more fever searches over here from the cloud testing data from diagnostics companies. We're seeing there's more COVID detections. And then from a little bit of sequencing, we might notice there's a bit of mutations happening. And now if we see a new fever indication over here, we might say, okay, this is something we want to look at more closely because it seems like we're seeing some more severity. So that's what we kind of liked, where we ended up with the modular nature, is that if Twitter gets bought by some other billionaire tomorrow and just goes away, we can plug in other data streams and our interpretation engine can keep just cleaning the data, and then our interpretation engine can take into account some of that genomics data and keep it separate but updatable.